All right, so welcome once again to all, todos, todas y todes, everyone. Welcome to Tertuliando en Cuarentena, gathering in quarantine, space of accidental intentionality and intentional accidentality. We like to use this kind of like a table metaphor. We sit together, we exchange ideas, we talk, and where we have accessible conversations and dialogue, which are so important in times as these, in times of pandemia, and also just in times of so much propaganda and BS. So we can sit and talk and share ideas, and also realize that being vulnerable is not weakness, but is a strength. And I think we need a lot of that. So something that I really enjoy about this space is that it has allowed me to meet such extraordinary people, amazing people doing great things coming from that space, from that area of vulnerable and just that space of vulnerability of offering oneself as honestly and candidly as one can. And I believe that our guest tonight, morning time, where he's joining us from. And that's one of the things I think is just phenomenal about this space is that we're in totally different time zones. He is in the future. So he's coming in with even far more progressive ideas that we don't have here in the past. So without any further ado, let's bring on, join us straight from Australia, Gavin Stanbrook. Let's see here. Aha, hermano, how are
Hello.
you?
Good, thank you, brother. How are you?
Great, man. Really have been looking forward to this dialogue, and thank you so much for joining in. I tend to say that I am quite grateful for people joining in that don't exactly know what they're getting into. So there's a whole lot of there's a whole lot of faith that they're putting this act of willingness to. So I am really grateful that you jumped in.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm always. I mean, for anyone who's watching who knows me, I'm a very political person, and I'm an organized socialist. This is my, bread and butter. I think about politics, while I'm asleep. It's pretty. Uh, it's hard to not really, given the world that we're currently living in. And yeah, I really enjoy the chance to share my politics and my ideas and exchange of ideas with comrades from across the world. And yeah, I'm more than happy to join you today. So thank you.
So gracias. Thanks so much. So Gavin, I like to start things off here talking about the current context. You know, times of pandemia, and it's been now close to 6 months, or we're probably at that 6 month mark. Or getting close to that 6 month mark. And what has it been like for you this whole experience? And I define this question with it's kind of like a three tentacle question or three branches of a question. First, what were you finding yourself doing pre-pandemia? You know, in quite proximity to the time of quarantine and lockdown, what were you doing? What was your routine? You know, professionally, personally, and then once the second part of the question, once the pandemia hits, you know, how did it impact what you're doing, and how has it been, this navigation of these past 6 months been like for you and your endeavor? And then the third part of the question is in terms of looking at society, locally at large, the world community, what observations have you made? What assessments, diagnoses have you made in spark of the pandemia? What things do you what things do you think it has brought to the surface that were probably there, probably better hidden, but this has brought them up to a more undeniable realm, perhaps. So, what were you doing before pandemia hits? How has it affected you personally, professionally, the whole run of 6 months, and also your views in terms of society and what this has brought up to the surface?
Awesome. I think that's a really good starting question to give you guys an idea of the walk of life that I'm from. So I guess at the start of, well, kind of before COVID just hit, it was actually a very crazy time in Australia. We were already very versed and very comfortable with wearing masks. And you guys will probably know because obviously in that side of the world, in California, there's wildfires raging usually just before our fires kick off, and I'm pretty sure they've already been taking place in the last couple of weeks. We had basically some of the biggest and most intense fire and bushfire season that the country's ever had. The heating up of climate change has meant that Australia's bushland is basically like a tinderbox, and the Australian government is like horribly like underprepared to deal with the current climate crisis that we're facing. So, for example, the amount of funding that was cut to the firefighter service for regional services in New South Wales alone, the state where I'm from, was in the tune of millions, and nationally it was in the tune of billions. So this was before the fires actually hit. So basically, before COVID hit, I was hitting the streets fortnightly, weekly, protesting for climate justice. So as a socialist here, I'm in the organisation Socialist Alternative, and we're pretty much involved in everything and anything that goes on in this country, and in particular in the major cities. And one of the campaigns that I've been involved in was the campaign for Uni Students for Climate Justice. So it's more of a group around university students and young workers who are interested in getting involved and active around the issue. And immediately after the fires, we organised rolling protests in Sydney and around the country that had upwards of 20 to 50,000 people at them. That eventually pitted out, but that's what we were doing before the fires, before COVID hit. So we were quite comfortable wearing masks, and we were very comfortable protesting. Most of the people in Sydney probably know me from a protest, either getting up and speaking or standing on a stall trying to talk to them about Marx or Trotsky. Like that's my kind of routine when it comes to the activist scene. So the COVID crisis hits, and it's pretty insane how it comes about. Like the whispers of COVID within the global economy, and within our communities, and the spread of it, I think started in November, December. Governments were aware then. They already knew that this was happening. They already had some idea that there was a potential for this thing to spread, or at least our government did. And then you have it hit, but it doesn't really actually make them second guess anything or make them take anything seriously until about February, when they start to realize more and more that large sections of Australia's industry, which rely on exports, are going to be undermined because of the COVID crisis, and in particular the higher education sector. So in Australia, the higher education sector, I think, is the third or second, maybe the third or fourth largest export for Australia in terms of higher education. So bringing international students into Australia to provide degrees for them, and they pay exorbitant rates. Like they get whacked massively with student fees, and that's where the main concern was for a bunch of the institutions. What's going to happen to our economy? How are we going to continue to maintain our profits? And I think that really, has to be the backdrop of Australia's response to the COVID crisis. So in the outset, you had it was a kind of I guess the way to describe it would be complete hypocrisy on the front of communication. They were making arguments around saying, oh well, we can't have these certain gatherings, these personal gatherings. You can't do these kind of activities, for example, funerals, weddings, family gatherings, these kind of things, which, I'm not a denier of the COVID situation. I think it is very real. And I think that I think it's very sensible to suggest that we shouldn't be meeting in large numbers during the period of a pandemic. But you can't say that to people at the same time as saying workplaces remain open and we're not going to regulate those workplaces and we're not going to enforce the PPE requirements on those workplaces. Schools remain open. We're not going to regulate they say they regulate, but really, how do you regulate a classroom of 30 to 40 students? You can't. So it was completely contradictory. And that has been the case throughout all of the messaging. They've, saying, no, we've got to close borders, which I also agree with, but we have to keep these workplaces open. We have to continue to allow some borders to remain open because those regions of the country have large tourism industries. And so if those tourism industries go out the window, that's it. And one of the incredible things, because in all of this, the Black Lives Matter movement has just burst at the seams. It's really just like, I think, washed away a bunch of the rusted on, calcified, I guess, frustration that people were feeling in the period of COVID.
Yeah.
Because you can feel the downward pressure on you, on your wages, on your mental health, on your your physical being, how you feel. And so this movement bursts at the seams and kind of breaks things open. I think it's incredible given that's going on, because in Australia we had, we've got our own struggle for black rights and justice here, for, First Nations justice. And some people have different words for it. And it was actually, Aboriginal communities that were the most militant and most forthright in demanding COVID protection, to the point of even blockading their entire communities. So the tourism industry in the Northern Territory, for example, it makes huge amounts of profit out of the setup that they've got out of Uluru. So Uluru, or Ayers Rock, as it's called in the white man's dictionary, it's one of Australia's most significant tourist attractions, and every year, I couldn't give you a figure, but it's definitely in the millions, the amount of money that the national park brings in. And the government was trying to allow flights coming in from Brisbane, where there's COVID hotspots, to travel over into the Northern Territory. So these states are really close to each other. And in the Northern Territory, the demographic is quite like you've got Aboriginal communities in the regions, and you've got some like outposts of farming and stuff like that, and you've got kind of tight knit, overly populated urban centres like Alice Springs and Darwin. So it's not really like a state where you've got large urban, suburban living.
Yeah.
Not at all. So it's one of those situations where if COVID got into one of those communities, it would wipe out the community. So for those communities, it really was life or death. And so you can see that, they were very much on the front foot, blockading their communities, stopping tourism industry, stopping tourists, making sure that no one was going to go in there and potentially put their community at risk. At the same time, though, mind you, we're organising our Black Lives Matter protests in Sydney, taking strength from the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, taking strength from the incredible uprising that's taken place over there. And we're organising protests in Sydney. And one of the lines from the media and the government is, hey, don't you know COVID's happening? COVID's a thing. And aren't you doing worse for your people by organising this protest? You know what I mean? And this is at the same time as our own people in the Northern Territory are blockading a multi-million-dollar tourism complex because they are more concerned about COVID than the profits of these companies. You know what I mean? So you can see how
it's very dualistic and very conveniently argued.
Exactly. And I think that's that kind of the political interest behind that and the motivations behind that are very much coming from the same place as what the motivations are for keeping schools open, keeping workplaces open. It's all the same people.
Yeah.
Capitalism as a class divided system, in the way that I see it as a Marxist, it means that it points to these individuals as part of a class within our society that have somewhat competing interests. Tourism can sometimes have competing interests with the mining industry, and in Australia, the mining industry is one of the biggest and most powerful sections of capital. But
Wow.
that they collectively have an interest in opening the borders, keeping workers in workplaces, keeping the kids in schools so the workers can go to work. You know what I mean? They all have a collective interest in that.
There's a chain connection.
Exactly. And so for the 6 months, that those motivations have been it's kind of like been a tug of war in a way. Like one of my comrades, Tom Bramble, really described it well. I can't get his post up, but he made this great comment about it, saying that it's been the class struggle underneath has been about to what extent we're going to open up society, and the mainstream, so the media, politicians, big business, they're saying open it up, open it up, open it up. And ordinary people, for the most part, are actually doing the right thing.
Yeah.
We have these people with no mask walking around screaming at the police saying, I'm not going to let you take away my freedom and whatever. But it's very much overstated, I think.
It's not the majority. Nonetheless, you have a pocket of people that are definitely voicing out these things. Just like here in the U.S., I don't know. Well, here in the U.S., I'm going to take the liberty to assume that it's definitely more than, percentage-wise, than in Australia, because it's I'm sure it has to do a lot with the culture as well, that permeates that type of climate to talk about. To talk about liberties being taken away when that kind of thing happens, but remain utterly silent when there's a whole list of more obvious and tangible, measurable things that would equate to liberties being taken away, but no voice there, and it is quite evidently the result of successful propaganda, and I don't mean to use such a heavy loaded word to some people. Just propaganda is basically just false information. Well, it's propaganda is basically when you propagate something, but when I'm talking about propaganda is basically when you propagate false information as though it were true, and it's usually characterized by being overly reductionist, by not really seeking to formulate conversation. It does the conversation for you. It's basically like taking food, shoving it in your mouth, chewing it all together, and taking whatever nutrient value, keeping it to yourself, and then just spitting it out, no nutrient value whatsoever, and giving it to someone else to eat it, and say, yeah, here's all the nutritional values contained here. Chew it. Trust me, it'll make you a better person. I think that's my little momentary and impromptu definition of propaganda. It does not inspire. It does not instill conversation. It does not generate conversation. It's already done it. It's the period. It has no question mark. Something I like to do in this space is to get to know a little bit better people, our guests joining in, to talk a little bit about their pilgrimage, to talk a little bit about their lives, and I do it via this question about moments of transformation in life. So if you can point to 3 moments that you think have 3 moments of cathartic nature throughout your life. It could be as far back as to when you were a little baby, as far as you can remember, and as recent as to Jesus a few minutes ago. There is no patent regulation here. It's whatever you feel are moments of transformation in your life. It could be moments, instances, processes, seasons, but three of those that you feel have been significant enough to shape the person who you are today?
Yeah, wow, big question. Definitely. I guess probably I would like to put it in a, point out the three and try and make it in a kind of a chain to say, oh, then it was a building up of moments. But I
You could be
guess,
zigzagging it. Does
yeah,
you share as you
zigzagging.
please.
Probably the first one. Okay, right. So I, we're getting into a bit of a deep area here. So I'm
That's
so
allowed
I'm
here. We can be deep here.
yeah. Thanks, brother. Yeah. So as you know, I'm from the I'm First Nations in Australia. So I'm from the Gambanga people. So we're from the mid north coast of Australia. So where I'm sitting right now is Nambucca Heads, which is on Gambanga country, and it's probably the main city that for your viewers to get a sense of where I am is Coffs Harbour. And so that whole region, 45 minutes south, an hour north, that's all Gumbaynggirr land. And I come from a family that has, we come from a people that has experienced intense, um, intense oppression, warfare, genocide. Everything you could think of under the banner of colonialism has taken place in this country. Slavery has taken place in this country that people don't know about. Aboriginal people were chained at the neck up until the 1950s in the Northern Territory in the street. One of the most significant massacres in our history took place in 1927, the Umbungari massacre on the west coast. That was led by WA constables. So just to give you a context of the intensity of racism in this country, because I think that each countries have their own distinct experience, and that informs the oppression that our communities experience, I think. And so in Australia, my mum was born in 67, right? So she was born 2 weeks before the referendum in Australia. The referendum was the national plebiscite on whether to allow Aboriginal people to be considered in the Constitution. So prior to 67, we were considered animals or plants.
Wow.
So we were considered under part of the Flora and Fauna Act. And, 67, that's 1967. So for 2 weeks, my mum wasn't even considered a human being, which I think is something useful for you guys to know. Now, bring that to the mid-north coast, to Gambanga country. So the memory that I have, the reason I have to say that is just to give you a bit of idea of the story that I'm going to talk about. So I come from
just a little interruption. There's a little bit. I don't know what happened with your microphone. I don't know if there's a slight change. I mean, I can still hear you, but there was a slight change into the how your sound is coming in. I don't know if there was a plugging and plugging off. I just want to, because I don't want to miss any aspects of this great story you're about to tell.
Of course. No. Can you hear me now, brother?
Susie, can you maybe unplug and plug it in? Your. All right.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. There's a little bit of a buzzing, humming. Ahora está bien. Now it's good.
Good.
Oh no, cool. Not good anymore. I don't know. There's something. I don't know if the.
Sorry. You know what? I think it's this. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
I'm in my house and at my brother's place, so I'll just double check to make sure nothing's turned on.
I think it's fine now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just might be the line every now and then, but keep on going. If anything awesome. Abnormal happens, I'll let you know.
Yeah, give me a wave. Yeah.
Dale.
Awesome. So, I'll just back to where I was. So I come from a community where, we've experienced the lot. We've been displaced from our ancestral lands. And that's taken place from invasion in the mid to late 1800s all the way up until today. So, I've got two great grandmothers on either side of my First Nations heritage where they've been married to white men, had children to these white men, and then when the white men have died, they've the deed to the land that those white men had has been relinquished, has been taken by the state, and the families have been shipped up and put onto Aboriginal reserves. So this has happened twice in the history of my family. Just gives you a sense, right? So I come from a small country town of Barraville, where there was a series of murders in the early 90s, so between 1990 and 1991. And three of those young people who were taken were my cousins. So the story itself, it's hard really to go into today without dragging on. But effectively, there was no justice delivered because of the racism of the police. And for anyone who wants to find out more about the case, just go on Google Barraville murders, and you can actually find a few articles that I've written in Red Flag newspaper about it as well. If you want a perspective from the families and from people who are involved in the struggle for justice. And so that one of the memories that I have is is trying to search for my cousin. I'm 27 now. I was born in 1993, so I wasn't even alive when my cousin was taken from us. She was taken in the 1990s. We still haven't found her body, and I have memories, very clear memories from the ages of 10 and upwards of going out and doing these searches and looking. And that, for me, I think the reason I point to that as an important moment was because it has the kind of the backdrop of the kind of intensity and the extreme racism that we experienced in our own land. But it was kind of like, I think it was one of the first moments where I realized that actually we're really on our own. Like, there's no, like, we only have each other. The state is not going to help us. The institutions of capitalism are not there to look after us. And obviously, like, as a 13-year-old, I'm not sitting there going, Marx said this, and like, it wasn't like I drew it in that sense, but it was more just the feeling of, like, actually, if you want anything in this world, if you want justice, you have to go out and do it for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You can't expect people like, the Labour Party or the Greens or any of these, right-wingers who want to run the system. You can't expect them to do it for you. You have to go out and do it for yourself. And I think that was one of those moments that really crystallized that for me, because it was just us doing it, And obviously we haven't found our cousin yet, but we've learned that actually we can't rely on the institutions in order to deliver justice for us. Now, that's the first one. I can go into the next straight in.
No, yeah, like. No, I like it because you're giving proper context. It's good.
Yeah. So the next one is jumping ahead for this one, and it was actually at a recent protest that I was involved in. Actually, two recent protests. It's kind of two moments mixed in one, if that's good. Okay.
Yeah,
but they're they're very connected. So, three moments actually. Sorry, but I'll be quick.
No,
so
you're good.
So when I first got involved in socialist organising, I came across my comrades in Socialist Alternative at a protest for Aboriginal rights in Sydney. So in Sydney, there's a heritage site that's traditionally been identified with the black community. The Australian version of the Black Power movement was formed in this area. And there's just been a long history of black militant and radical activists, coming in and out of the Redfern community, or the block as they called it in Sydney. And at this time in 2015, the bureaucratization of the housing corporation, which is run by community members of the Aboriginal community within that community, they started to look at corporate models in order to make revenue. And, what does that mean for our people on the ground who need housing and welfare? It means that their interests are going to come second, third, maybe fifth, maybe last. And so one of the aunties, Auntie Jenny Munro, launched a campaign to save the block, and she set up a tent embassy. And just to give your viewers a bit of context, the history of tent embassies in Australia is quite significant. There's a tent embassy outside of Canberra that was set up in the 60s, 70s period, and that served as a central hub for Aboriginal political aspirations and organising. And so Auntie Jenny set one up in Redfern on the block in 2015 to claim back, like land rights for us on that land. Because once you have an organisation that no longer represents the interests of the people that live there, that fundamentally changes their relationship to that community, because they're no longer looking to serve the interests of that community. Selling off the housing to private student accommodation services is not meeting the interests of that community. So that's where I met them, at this protest, and that's not so much the significant moment, but the significant moment was I was always, we have this term in our community called wetty. It means like if you're a bit like, oh, I don't really want to get into the fight, like I'm not sure about that, like that's a bit like I don't know about getting a bit roughed up, like I'm not sure, like if you're feeling a bit uncomfortable about being confrontational. And I always had that as a young person, because I think partly because of the trauma we experience as because of the oppression that we experience in the society. So one of the main protests that I went along to before I really got involved in Trotskyist politics was a protest against the far right in 2015. This was after the Tent Embassy rally, and my comrades were like, "Oh yeah, Gavin, yeah, meet us here. We're gonna set up, we're going to get organised, and we're going to try and challenge these far-right dickheads. Like, we don't want them to organise and protest and thinking that they can just get away with that. Like, no fascism on our streets, basically." And for me, I was like, yeah, fuck yeah, that sounds great. But then the other side of me was like, oh, I don't know about getting real close to them fascists. and in Melbourne, just a few weeks before that protest, they had the most incredible anti-fascist protest I'd ever seen in my life. Cool. And obviously, that's not really saying much. It's not anti-fascist protests in Germany, definitely not. But it was a militant protest where they challenged fascists in the heart of the Melbourne CBD, and they drove them off the streets. And so that kind of inspired us to say, well, we're going to do that here, and we're going to stop them from organising. But I didn't jump into the fray. I stood on the side because my comrade was like, "Oi, come on, come up to the line with us." And I was like, "Oh yeah, no," and a lot of comrades who are watching this today are probably going to laugh at me. But I'm just going to be straight up about that. I was a bit like, "Oh, I don't know about that," and my experience with the police, because the police were there and the police were trying to stop us from doing that.
Yeah.
My experience with the police tells me, hey, just stay away from them. Just stay clear of these people, And I think that's partly why the police exist, because they need to instill that fear on ordinary people.
Yeah.
Every time they drive past, your spine kind of clicks up and you're like, oh fuck, are they going to pull me over now? Or am I gonna be that next person that gets beaten up on or something? So that feeling comes into it, and I'm standing there, and my comrades are pushing the line, and they're pushing back against cops, right? And these are whatever, they're just from all different backgrounds, young students, whatever. And I'm just like, this is great, but I don't feel like I can do that right now. So that was, I think I point to that moment because it was a moment where it really was a moment where it put the kind of the bare face of me, of who I am, on show, and said, hey, well, this is a moment where you either push forward and go and move beyond these insecurities and insecurities, these feelings that now that I think about it are consciously instilled in me to stop me from rebelling. You know what I mean? It's like, do you break against that and do you push back and do you actually start to go forward, or do you stay in that current moment and allow those ideas to influence whether you're going to resist or not?
Yeah.
And so, and then, you know, fast forward to the next moment that I want to talk about was when two moments where I've taken on the police, and not just one copper, like 4, 5, in one case 10, and I've, you know, through the sheer force of thousands of people standing behind me and my voice yelling really loud in their face, have been able to literally like part the Red Sea, kind of, in a way. And it's really, you know, like I can't speak for comrades in the United States, but for in Australia, like, for young black men and women to stand up and literally use their mouth and the force of people behind them to dictate to police what the police are going to do, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so the first instance came at the murder of young Kumanjai Walker. Now, it's important, that case, because his case is currently going through the courts right now in the Northern Territory in Alice Springs. So just for your viewers, Kumanjai Walker was a young Aboriginal boy from the Northern Territory who was basically shot dead by the police at point blank range, according to the reports. And the way that they did it was that they walked into his house without declaring themselves and then shot him. And in Australia, in most states, the police can't do that. They're not allowed to just walk into your house. But in the Northern Territory, there's a history of racist policy in that state. That means that the police are allowed to walk into Aboriginal people's houses, not white people, but Aboriginal people's houses without announcing themselves.
Yeah.
So they can just walk in and then they're in, right? And they can do whatever they want, and they can lie about it on the stand later, which we all know they do. So young Kumanjai Walker is shot and murdered, and for Aboriginal people at that moment, it was like it reminded me a bit of a Mike Brown moment, in a way. And I can't say that it spurred the same level of social explosion, but I think that it definitely pushed the agenda forward and forced people to actually start to take this thing more seriously and start to look at it more seriously. And what galvanized that was the call to action by Black Lives Matter organizers to actually protest when someone gets shot. And so immediately when young Kumanjai was murdered, protests were springing up across the country.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm one of the organizers in Sydney, so I kind of just got involved with that, you know, doing what I can, helping out, pulling things together. And we organised a protest within 3 days in Sydney that had over 1,000 people at it. And at that protest, before the protest took place, because I was like the one of the organisers, the police, you know, always try and put pressure on the organisers. They try and make organisers jump through hoops to hold protests, all these kind of things. So, you know, before the protest actually took place, maybe 3 hours before it took place, I've got the bloody local sergeant saying, "Oh, you know, you haven't done this, and so, hey, just know that if you step onto the street, we might just lock you all up." And it's like, well, get fucked. We're going to do it anyway. And obviously dealt with that. And then, so the moment where this thing, I think the moment comes in, you know, the example that I'm trying to get at, after we start marching. And we're marching to the Surrey Hills police station, which is significant because it's the biggest police, like one of the biggest police stations in the urban centre of Sydney. And there's a strong history of that that police station and the over policing of Aboriginal communities and working class communities as well, because the urban suburbs of Sydney were predominantly working class up until about the 60s, 70s. That it's only through gentrification, through the neoliberal period, that we've seen that go away. But anyway, so we're marching to Surrey Hills Police Station, and you could imagine the cops and their anger at the idea that an entire crowd of multiracial crowd led by Aboriginal people is marching outside of a cop station because they shot one of our brothers. They want us to not do anything. They want us to say, "Oh, isn't it sad? Maybe he shouldn't have said that to the cop." Like they want us to wallow in our despair and direct our attention. Yeah, and so we're marching, and the cop presence is huge. In the same way that you have massive cop presence at Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, it's same here, and it's for the same reason. The police, there's an underlying thing where the police see ordinary people as problems that need to be policed. Yeah. But then there's the more pressing fact that we're protesting against you people in blue or black, the ones who think you have the right to shoot us, kill us, and walk away. You know what I mean? Like, we are protesting you, and they know that, and so they need to try and undermine what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so the moment comes when literally, like, they're trying to. One of the ways that they try and stop us is they're pushing us onto one side of the road, and we're trying to take the whole street. Right? We've got 1,000 people, and so the cops are pushing, and so I stopped the whole protest because I'm leading the protest with a few of my comrades, and we stopped the protest in the middle of an intersection. We have a few speeches, and we go, "All right," I put my hand up. I think I did it before the speeches, whatever. And I said, "Look, the cops are trying to stop us from taking this street, but how dare they? Who do they think they are? We're out here because of what they've done. We have every right to protest. We have every right to take these streets. So now I want everyone to follow me, and we're gonna walk past the police line, and we're gonna take the entire intersection." And we did, and the cops just had to back off. You know what I mean? Because they recognized that I had an entire force of people behind me.
Of course, yeah.
And that they were willing to listen to what I said and move, even if that meant that the police were going to push back against them. And so in that moment, it really undermined the power of the police and put not put a dent in the structure of the police in any way. It's they're doing everything as they were before, but in that moment, I think it stopped them from being able to crush us. And
it was also doing something to you. I mean, to get to the essence of the transformation, which is what we've been talking about. These are, and I'm visualizing it. These are moments that don't go unnoticed in one's life. I'm sure this is super powerful. I've had moments of similar context, not of that nature of leading a march, but of transcendental value when you have like little maybe epiphanies or little moments of kind of like outer body experiences of holy shit, there's something going on here that's obviously, I mean, you probably have this relationship way before of this definitely this was way beyond me. Is way beyond me, and all the deconstruction that needs to occur to realize that policing is a myth, that need for policing is a myth, and is a myth constructed on the premise that we can't take care of each other, that we can't do things right, and we need them. We need a body that has been built on a horrific notion that following that line of thought, they can't, it's so paternalistic. They can't take care of themselves. So here we are. It is, and when things are based off of myths, on constructions that might have layers of noble ideas, like, yeah, we're here to protect and serve. But then you see the proxies, you see it put into practice. Yeah, yeah, you are here to protect and serve. Yeah, protect and serve the status quo. Because as
Mhm.
things have unfolded, is what has been shown. Yeah, there are some examples of maybe a cat was on a tree and a police officer helped save the cat. I mean, of course. I mean, I don't think there's anything that's 100% evil. Not even if we are to follow on maybe Christian metaphor, not even the devil is 100% evil. So this is not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that systemically it is not designed to it is not designed benevolently. It's just not.
Mm.
It is
Mm.
designed placed on top of a system that is already there to perpetuate a capitalistic structure that is only going to benefit a certain amount of people, and
Yep.
then the other ones are going to be the kind of like the ones on the lower end where the dominoes are landing on them. So there's going to be the ones affected. And I'm really interested in throughout the pilgrimage of your life how you came to knowledge of Karl Marx and what Marxist thought represented then and what Marxist thought represents now. If you can explain a little bit and maybe debunk some myths as to Marxism, and also maybe talk about perhaps some flaws that you see in Marxism, and maybe should I say Marxisms? Because there was only one Marx, but maybe the different types of thoughts that come out of that. Because, like I said, there's only
Definitely.
one Marx. But a little of that to lay just very honestly how you came to knowledge of it, and just your pilgrimage through it, and whatever you might be able to remember out of that
Definitely.
extensious question I just asked.
Definitely. Well, I think the first thing to start off with is to say that I was an anti-capitalist before I was a Marxist, um, and I think you have to have some form of frustration with capitalism in order to be able to get the ideas of Marxism, because you have to be prepared to be open to the idea that something is fundamentally wrong with the system, and not just aspects of it, but that the entire system as a whole has to go. You know what I mean? And I guess the 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 reason that spoke to me so much was because I, as a young person growing up in this country, um, I experienced the racism that Aboriginal people experience in this country, whether it's just the institutional through the regular the police checkups, the problems with getting all different kinds of things. Really, actually, it's quite complex. But in another way, there's the interpersonal as well. So you deal with the daily microaggressions from small business owners and your teachers and these kind of things. So all of that shapes you. But then I went into the workforce quite quickly, straight out of high school. So I got very quickly versed in the experience of being exploited by someone, and and as well as a young uh, a young guy who doesn't really like to take orders too much. Like, sometimes I would push back against the people in my workplace, and that would create that feeling of like, oh, there's an indifference of power here that has to be resolved,
Mm-hmm.
that can't be resolved within the current system, within capitalism. So it was those experiences and the general frustration with the system that made Marxism so appealing. But I think really the core of it was the working class. So, I subscribe to a classical form of Marxism, uh, whereas you probably know that there's traditions that go off in the direction of Mao, Stalin, and then there's obviously there's like Trotskyism is a tree in and of itself, because there's like all different branches within that. But I think the best way to describe my politics is that I'm for the self-emancipation of the working class. So that literally means the working class emancipate themselves. It's not going to be done by anyone from on high. It's not going to be done from a certain like layer of people who are a bit more smart, who are a bit more educated. No, it's going to be done by the working class themselves. And I think that slogan really encapsulates the core of the direction that I'm going in as a Marxist. And
specifically so sorry to cut you off, but specifically into Trotsky, and kind of like where does Trotsky play in here, that it might
yeah,
a little bit more
yeah,
into maybe a Marxist branch, or I don't want to
yeah,
put words. So if you can talk a little bit more of
totally. So basically, the prominence of Trotsky as a Marxist comes from his involvement within the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Civil War. So he was one of the leading theorists within the Bolshevik Party. Although he wasn't in the Bolshevik Party in 1917, he joined in 1917. So he has serious credibility in that sense of being one of the leading Marxists who, led one of the first successful working class revolutions. Where Trotsky gains his even more kind of historical significance, I think, is his organizing and like trying to battle, I guess, the Stalinist bureaucracy that was forming within Russia from basically like 1923 onwards. And if you look at the history of Russia and the Communist Party, there's all of these like texts and these kind of things that go through the debates that were taking place between the left faction against Stalin. So I guess the importance there is not so much to look at the into battling of individual personalities, but more so the carrying of a legacy of Marxism that centers the emancipation of the working class at its heart. Because what Stalinism represented was a really a degeneration and actually a complete break with the concept of working class people emancipating themselves. And really a complete break with the concept of revolution altogether. Because, I mean, you only have to look at the Stalinist regimes today, and obviously this is a debate that still exists on the left. But, my opinion is that those regimes are not anything to be celebrated. A regime on the top that calls himself communist is no different to a regime on the top that calls himself capitalist if they rule in the same way. If the working class doesn't physically run society through democratic debate and discussion, and then going back to their workplace and feeding that to their comrades, and that kind of dialectical relationship between politics and the economy, if that doesn't exist, then you don't have any form of working class power. And Stalinism represents the complete break with the idea that that's what we need. And Stalinism dominates politics today. One of the big ones is around
even outside communism. Is that what you're saying? Like that essential substance.
Yeah. Because and the reason it does is because Stalinism really is just another brand of reformism. And reformist politics is age old. Reformists have been organizing in political organizations like the Labour Party in Australia and in Britain, in the Social Democratic Party in Germany. There's a strong history of organized reformist parties. Stalinism, very quickly came to be another expression of reformism, but with a left badge. And when you have the revolution of Russia as part of your repertoire of incredible things that the communist movement had done, militant working class people still identified with Russia and still identified with that kind of with that form of communism. And that took place well into the 70s. The explosion of radicalism in the 60s and 70s were heavily influenced by Maoist and Stalinist tendencies. More so Maoist, and I think in the United States, you look at the history of the Students for a Democratic Society, for example, there's strong history there of Maoist intervention. I would argue not for the better, but but still, like, that you had these different formations that have taken on their own
Yeah, is the
brand of
conversation going?
communism.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Is the conversation ongoing? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's part of the continued discussion, and yeah.
have you, and like in your, and as we try to, you know, it's such a, I mean, it's such a great topic. I mean, we're probably gonna have to do a sequel to this, because I definitely want to respect your time. And I think of Latin America. I don't know if you've ventured into movements in Latin America. For example, you know, taking the case of Pepe Mujica. I don't know if you know about his case in Uruguay when he was a president. I don't know if it's over a decade ago, but his line of thinking in terms of in harsh contrast to other Latin American regimes or presidencies, uh, or in the case of in Bolivia. I don't know if you've ventured a little bit into Latin American politics.
Somewhat, yeah. Like I can't say at all that I'm an expert. Like yeah, but I know that there is a history of, you know, the left supporting, Latin American governments and different formations that are part of the pink tide, what they would have called it. It's just like I think it was like in the 2000s that you
Mhm.
sort of, yeah. Uh,
And,
so I
and
know a bit about that, but
and,
yeah.
and and the reason I asked it isn't to kind of like do a pop quiz or anything. It's just is to maybe ask you, get some feel as to what worldwide now, or maybe like within the last 10 years to now, where are some pockets of hope that you might see? And I'm not talking about like I mean I believe in utopia as a point of reference. I don't think it's as a point of like, yeah, we've gotten there, but as a reference point. But what places have you seen that maybe are closer to that utopia?
Hmm.
Um,
Well, one of the I think one of the most important things for us, for me as a Marxist, and it's encapsulated in that concept of, self emancipation of the working class, is that you have to envisage this change, this fundamental transformation in society, as a transformation that has to first take place in the heads of the people who are going to achieve that transformation. You know what I mean? Like, shifting consciousness is fundamental, I think, in radically changing the society that we live in. Because really, we've got to remember that capitalism is an economic system, but it's also a social system. It's a very complex social system that means that there's all these relationships that, if you kind of sat down for a second and put it onto paper and said, well, that relationship's ridiculous, like the relationship between a king and a serf, like under feudalism, they could be in the same room and the serf would, bow down to the ground. They would do all of these crazy things that for us today would look at and think, that's ridiculous.
yeah.
That they're just people. What the hell is going on here? You know what I mean? So capitalism is similar in that there's these complex relations that seem
We do the
outlandishly
same. We do the
crazy.
same. But
Like Jeff Bezos, the first trillionaire who communicates with a worker on the ground, who he might not directly communicate, but sends out messages, whatever. He's got workers who are like eating out of bins because they don't have enough money. They can't. They've only got one job. They need 3 jobs to pay rent. Like, those kind of social relations are
it's
crazy, but
ludicrous.
they exist in our society, right? So this is the world in which we live in. And so what we need to do is we need to raise the consciousness of the working class. And when I say raise, I don't mean like, hey, read Marx, take this book and read Marx. No, I don't mean that. Don't do that. No, I mean, get in the fucking struggle and be a part of the fights that they are leading, and get involved in what's going on, and actually conceive of yourself as someone who can be a part of that struggle and who can have an impact on that. You can work with the leaders. You can work with people who are involved in these movements. I think for me, Marxists, that's one of the most important questions, is how do we change the consciousness of working people so that they look at those relationships and they say, well, that's wrong. We can't have a parasitic class owning a majority of the wealth. We can't have, we can't have aged care patients eating gruel while the CEOs are driving Maseratis, because that's what's happening in Australia. Like, we can't have that. And so now we need to move forward and smash the current context, smash the system in its current form, because the only way you can do it is by smashing it, I think. I don't think the police, the military, the state is going to just sit by while the working class creates socialism on the sidelines. That's not going to happen. So you need to smash it. And so now the reason I give that background or that context is important because for me, every rebellion around the world right now, and not every rebellion, because obviously you don't support the Kyle Rittenhouses of the world getting out in the streets with fucking assault rifles. You don't support that. That's outrageous. But you look at the rebellions, like the struggle for Black Lives Matter in the United States and the incredible multiracial youth uprising that's inspired. You look at the Sudanese revolution of 2019. You look at the massive militant uprising in Hong Kong for Hong Kong freedom and democracy. You look to Syria and the revolution that took place there and the revolutions that it was connected to in 2011 with the Arab Spring. These movements are they're kind of like they're the forum for that transformational change. So I'll give you an example. Sudan in 2019, in Khartoum, in the capital, they had this massive square they set up that was outside of the military and administration offices. So, the key institutions of the Sudanese ruling class, those state institutions, they held a massive protest outside of. And at the entrance to that walkway, there was a massive banner that hung from the top. And there's images of it online. I'm actually getting goosebumps just speaking about it now. But on that banner, it had literally a year, and then next to it in writing, the revolution, and like a kind of a reference to what happened. And it goes down and down and keeps going and goes from like, I don't know, like a couple of 100 years ago, whatever, all the way, not a couple of 100 years. It's like, it just details a bunch of the revolutions that have taken place in the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
And then lists their one as well, So it's a reflection of a conscious identification of these workers within Sudan with the revolutionary struggle, the struggle for some form of liberation that has taken place every decade under capitalism since its birth in 270 years ago. So these movements are where working class people break down and start to realize how fucked those social relations are. Sorry, I'm swearing a lot, but like, it's those moments where they actually start to understand and can grapple with the class realities of our society, but also so that they can actually organize and collectively decide what they're going to do about that. Because it's not just that you recognize it, it's that you recognize it and that you say, well, that can't go on any longer. And you feel that because you've got tens of thousands of other people who look exactly like you, standing side by side, thinking the same thing. And it's why I point to those movements as the key moments where we can actually push struggles forward, where you can actually dive, like, get those struggles to and move them forward into a direction that cuts at the heart of the system, because they already do. Like, really, the Black Lives Matter movement is raising the reality of state monopoly on violence. And we know that violence is not just something that is dished out to the Black community. I know that working class people from all different walks of life experience police oppression because of their class. And it's something that came up when you were talking about the police as an institution before. people think the first expression of the police was in Ireland when they were trying to manage the colonial government there. But actually, the first expression of the police ever was the River Thames Authority in the 1700s in London. So this was at a time when you had, slavers, these market, what do you call them? The merchant class. Yes, yeah, slave traders, but like, merchants in all different kinds of industries, but slavery was the key industry.
Yeah. It was like a shopping center for that.
Basically, yeah, you had that, and in London, because it was an expanding industry, you saw the birth of some of the early industrial, proletariat, as Marx would call them, or industrial workers, and they were like wharfies. So they were the people unloading all of the goods from the boats. And one of the things that they realized in that process was that they were getting massively exploited because, 5 or 10 years before, they were working on the land and they were managing their own plots of land. They understood the amount at which got taken from them and the amount at which they kept to themselves. So they understood their exploitation quite well. Not clearly, but you could see it quite clearly. And I think you put a farmer in another situation where you radically change their experience. They're now working for a boss for a wage, and it's scientific. The way in which they measure your wage is a constant downward pressure on your wage because they're trying to pay you less. You're now grouped together with other workers on the ports. So other people who are living the same experience as you and are feeling and thinking the same things. And so they all start stealing shit from the cargo, because they're like, well, we're getting ripped off here. We know that the boss earns more than what they're paying us. No. So we're just going to take some tobacco. We're going to take some spice. We're going to take some of this like silver or whatever that's in this cargo. And the ship owners and the merchants had to stop that because they realized that if they kept doing that drove down their competitive edge. Because if they're losing profit, that means that France is going to get the one up eventually, and we know from the early records, CLR James wrote about this really excellently, I think, in his book Black Jacobins, where he talks about the kind of rapid expansion of slavery and then market economies connected with slavery. In the birth of it, and so it's kind of like that experience at the Thames just kind of is a snowball effect where you have more and more industry, and then you have more and more need for a private armed body to protect that private property.
But then you have to create discourse to overtly justify it, and of course that is not very to the palate of society. Selling it like that, it's not a great marketing tactic. So then what do? Well, you might regenerate, you might make some reforms, you might expand as to what the tasks are for these for this new workforce.
Create new crimes.
So then you have a harder argument to make against it, because they're protecting people, they're doing this, and also because we tend to work, and I think that this might have something to do with the speed rate at which we get information, that we tend to think in binaries. We tend to think in black and white. So then to generate a genuine, necessary exchange and argument to start deconstructing what the real intentions or what the real consequences of policing are, it's almost impossible, because they're like, oh, but they're good, but they're all evil. This is not a personal attack. People need jobs. Some go work for the police, and that's another very commendable, very necessary comment to make too. What drives people to become police? It's not like that's also part. It's also a consequence of part of the problem. You know, that they get to the thread, the thread has been cut so short that's how far off some people have to go to make ends meet. You know,
Yeah.
so but that's another thing that we need to deconstruct. But getting to the very bottom premise of the problem is that society is so broken, and usually people are commenting on this are commenting it from angles of religion or other different sectors, are also adding to the problem, to really confronting this very necessary conversation, like what makes society broken, you know. And I think it has to do with like, as I stated, those binaries that we can't really have honest conversations as to where some things are leading us to, because our binaries are telling us, oh, I got to be Republican, I got to be Democrat, I got to be I got to, and I got to approach the conversation from this militant angle, from this other militant angle, and on both ends, it is completely sabotaging any possibilities of going further. Anyways, I really want to have a sequel to this conversation, but I want to ask you this final question. Count on it. Like, I'm going to invite you to the space again. But as a final question for today, and in that line of the previous question, talking about the utopias, and on a personal level, what are your utopias that keep you moving forward, as reference points in the horizon? You know, as people might say, you know, what's the point of the utopia if it's this unattainable thing? Well, it's there so you keep on moving forward, because you might take 5 steps, then it might take 5 steps forward, and you might not touch it, but it keeps you moving. So what are those utopias or utopias that keep you moving forward, that keep you, and especially in times as now, where it just seems like it's just all gone to the shitter. Like, it just seems like it's like you take 5. It's not even so much as you take 5 steps and then it takes 5 more steps. You take 5 and it takes like 500 steps. So what is that reference point that keeps you going?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because in these times it does make you think a lot more about that, about what matters and what is actually keeping you driving, I guess, keeping you on the road. I think for me, it's a few things. I think being, as an organized socialist, it's not so much that you're isolated all the time. It's more that, we live in a world where consciousness is constantly shifting, and not everyone's consciousness is at the same level as where you're at, in terms of, what you think about the world and what you think you need to do about it. And so, one of the big things is like, my comrades keep me going, I have to say. Having people who have the same goals as you, and who, commit themselves and much, much more to a struggle that is never going to ever, ever benefit you in the current capitalist system. Being an organized Trotskyist is not, if you ever want to, live a irrelevant life to the mainstream, irrelevant in the sense that, like, you're not going to be sitting at the table with them, drinking wine and Chardonnay and having, like, fish eggs or whatever, like caviar. You're not going to do that. And so, I think people who are prepared to commit their lives to such a project of building a revolutionary organization, I think are gold. I really do. And I think they inspire me. So I think that, that's not so much a utopia. It's more just it's a reality of who I have around me and the way in which they keep me grounded, but also keep me going. And so that's that. And then I think the other thing as well is the idea that, when I got involved in socialist politics in 2015, I'd been shaken up, and my consciousness had kind of been rattled a bit by the 2008 crisis, the financial crisis, and, the massive rebellions that were born out of that across Latin America, like the struggle in Chile right now. That has its roots going all the way back to the 70s, I think. But that, the struggle keeps bringing itself up. The struggle in Bolivia, that goes, like the interests and the political aspirations of First Nations people in that country are still yet to be realized. You know what I mean? And obviously there's discussions to be had there. So for me, I think the way that I conceive of this concept of utopia is it's interesting in a way, because it's the fact that it's not a utopia that means that that keeps me going, and
I like that.
It's the fact that it's not a utopia. It's the fact that actually, people don't just sit down and accept our oppression. We fight, we resist in any sort of way. Again, C.L.R. James writes about how black women who were forced into slavery in San Domingo or in what is now known as Haiti. They would do all sorts of things against their masters, little covert actions as a form of resistance and struggle, like even to the point of their own infanticide. Sorry, I don't know how to say that word properly, but like, because they knew that if they had children, that child would be born into slavery, into
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, infanticidio.
It's a form of resistance, and so we always resist, even under the most severe context of oppression. And I think for me, the fact that people are resisting today really just brings that core part of Marxism that really made it clear for me is agency of the working class. It really brings that into the picture and really says, actually, we're not sheep like the conspiracies would like to make us think we are. We're not just all dumb. We're not just all stupid. We know what's going on in the world. It just takes a bit of a push, takes a bit of our own collective discussion and collective education where we all come together and debate and decide what we're going to do. It takes a bit of that for us to work it out. And so you couple the current moment that we're in with my politics and the theories of working class revolution, and it turns a utopia into a possibility. And so I think that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, it's good, man. Gavin, thanks so much for giving a little bit of yourself here. I definitely value it. I feel like it definitely leaves me with an appetite of continuing conversation in some other occasion for sure, and continuing this sort of deconstructionist dialogue, and expanding it. So really, really grateful, man. Thank you so much.
Cheers for having me, brother. Really appreciate it.
So everyone who joined in, and some people left some comments, and everyone who joined in, passed by, drove through, thank you. And those who were watching on live and recorded mode, thank you also. You're free to comment, question, whatever, it's a very free and open space. So until next time, mucha paz, mucha amor to everyone else. Don't disconnect just right away, Gavin. And we'll see each other next time. Adiós a todos y todas y todos. Ciao.